Yeah, so I'm Joost Rekveld. I'm an artist from Belgium, and I'm an artist who's really curious about making instruments to make images. And the reason I'm curious about it is that I'm not so much interested in making these instruments to do exactly what I want, or to have, like, to just realize the images which I already have in my mind. But I'm really interested in using the process of making my instruments as a way to discover things. And so it's discovering of possibilities, of different possible visual languages. Those are things which really interest me. But in the last years, this has become much more also a process where I'm also discovering things about the technological world which surrounds us, and which which is partly a legacy of decisions which have been taken by previous generations. So I start to see my work also more and more as a way to probe this technological environment. Yeah, so I talked about probing the technological environment, and I'm also really interested in getting perspectives on this environment which are a bit different, or which are interesting because they're unusual. So I've worked with, before I worked with film techniques, so I was more like a kind of experimental animator, I guess. And for a while I also was writing code, so I was really doing like algorithmic image generation. And then I got really interested in some ways, in my mind, it was a way to sort of fuse these two interests in having something which is both about building physical machines and interacting with them also in a more embodied way. On the one hand, and on the other hand, still, the idea of algorithm or code or some kind of configuration being sort of responsible for producing the images. So I became really interested in electronics, analog electronics. And when sort of digging into the history of that, I suddenly remembered that when I was studying electronic music, that's partly my background, I was spending as a student like days or afternoons in the analog electronic studio where they have all these modules and you patch things together. It's like a big audio synthesizer. And then at one day when I was there was this mysterious device which appeared, which was, somebody told me it was an analog computer, and it also had the same, like it has cables and you patch things together. But then the difference was that instead of doing things with sound and having modules which do like filters or like generators of some kind, these were all only had mathematical symbols. So I had no idea what this could actually do and how you could use them. So when I got interested in going back to analog electronics, I remembered this, and then I started figuring out what they actually do, and I got really interested in them because they also are very interesting points, because it's a different paradigm of computing. So it's a kind of computing which has it has a long history. I mean, this existed for 3-4 decades as a fairly mainstream technology, but it's completely disappeared. Like, nobody really knows about it. I mean, very few people know about this history, and the paradigm is really different. I mean, it's a form of computing where the word information is not really mentioned. There's no memory, so it's really like one configuration. Let's say an electronic circuit is sort of performing something, or it's behaving in a similar way as some kind of physical system, for instance. So it's a way to simulate, to set up an electronic circuit to behave in a similar way. And yeah, so that's became like also kind of focus of this project, my project for the last 7 years, where I really, through this history, started thinking about, okay, well, how can you actually use this different paradigm of computing to generate images? And also through investigating this history and learning how to use these machines, how to repair these machines, how to build one from from scratch, my own one. I also started becoming much more aware of the history of all these different technologies. So it became really a kind of tool to explore, all these possibilities of going through a different paradigm of computing. Media archaeology, for me, this interest started from a very practical a concern. Like when it's actually before I got interested in like electronics or code. Like when I was really starting as a film student and yeah, making experimental animation and having no money, I realized quite soon that like interfering in like really the basics of, and at that time this was film. I was working on 16 or Super 8. Like, but interfering in the basics, that was really a very productive way for me to yeah, generate abstract images. Like I was really interested in abstract animation, like this whole history of visual music and the abstract animation classics like Fischinger and Whitney, all these people. And my problem was like, how do you actually make these images? Like this very practical way. Like how do you synthesize them? Like if this was before computer animation. So how do you? So I started building like optical, mechanical setups, and at some point I realized, like going back also to the history of pre-cinema, that it's a whole sort of repository of techniques and procedures to produce images or illusions of images, which were for me was a very fertile ground to look for principles and also things which were easy to build. I mean, because this is technology from 1880 or something. So somebody in 1980 or 1990 can, also build these things quite easily. So that's how it started, and then it became like, yeah. So it started really as a very practical concern, like how do I actually build my instruments to generate images, and then it became like much more like also an interest in this repository of all these different techniques which have existed, and some of them have also been lost or have only been invented and have only brought it to a prototype and then it never happened. So also all these sort of alternative timelines start sort of branching out, like what if, what if analog computing would have conquered the world and we would have now all analog computers. So that aspect also really interests me. And then in this last project, like this interest in analog computing, what happened is that I became also really much more aware of media archaeology as a kind of method or as an approach to probe the roots of our technological environment, and that happened because I started collecting. So I started collecting like really high-end analog signal processing or signal generating equipment. So these are things which nobody really wants anymore. Like they're obsolete, so they're very cheap. They're like huge devices which, in the 60s or in the 70s cost like a fortune. So I started collecting lots of these things. Also, that's partly how I learned about electronics, like by repairing these things. And then I started noticing that my collection, if you look at the labels on the devices, that if you look at the previous owners, it starts to be like a kind of mapping of the military-industrial complex, like in Europe, also in the US, because a lot of equipment is actually much cheaper in the US. So I became very aware of the origins or the sort of first environments for which these devices were built. And that a lot of these technologies have military roots or are otherwise problematic in their origins. So for me, media archaeology also becomes a way as to also investigate these roots and investigate their origins, but also as a way. Well, it's not a metaphor I usually use, but you could also perhaps even see it as a kind of, psychotherapy. Like you have to go through the original events to sort of also liberate these technologies and be aware of also the programs which are sort of embedded in these machines to be able to do something else. So that's like a second point, you could say. Like I was interested in instrument building, then I got really interested in the history. And then through there, I think there's also a much more philosophical point, is that we as a species, I think we are a species which, like a lot of our intelligence is actually based in the fact that we shape our environment, and we shape the environment in such a way that we make a lot of shortcuts for ourselves so that we can have behavior which we consider to be intelligent, but it's all predicated on the way we have shaped our environment. and the devices which surround us. So I think on a much more fundamental level, I think we are a species as humans which cannot actually really be very intelligent without this shaping of the environment. And media archaeology then also becomes a tool to really investigate this relation we have with the intelligence embedded, of the part of our intelligence which is embedded in our technological surroundings. But that's for me a quite recent development, but that's really something which for me is again a different view on media archaeology, which I find super interesting. Well, my interest in analog computing and also what I said about my development in thinking about media archaeology, the sort of focal point for those developments in my thinking, but also in my practice, was a project I did in the last 5 years. Well, depends a bit where you start counting. It could also be 8 years. And that's basically for now the project which really came out of this interest in analog computing. And I made a feature film which is called Mechanisms Common to Disparate Phenomena. And it started as a kind of, like I built an analog computer which can do like high frequency signals. So it can generate high frequency signals of frequencies which are necessary to produce analog video, an HD analog video. So it goes really, so it's in a way, the architecture is the same as the classical analog computers from the 50s mostly, except that the electronics is more recent. So instead of working with frequencies until like 1,000 hertz, it works with frequencies until like 100 megahertz. So you can really do high definition video. That was the idea. And while working on this project, so I discovered, or I sort of became aware of this sort of military legacy I was sort of collecting also. So this became a very concrete presence in my studio. So that became also really something I was thinking I should address in a work. So I was also thinking about, okay, I had been exploring lots of ways to use analog computing to create images, but how do I then sort of incorporate this context in it? So I was thinking about that one. And then this context for me is this military, like the Cold War, the arms race. Analog computers were basically a side effect of the work what was done to model supersonic missiles. So it's also very intimately connected to all these things. And then I got really interested also in the idea that in the Cold War you have, like in the beginning of the 60s, you had the beginning of like this global surveillance system. So you have the Americans and the Soviet Union building systems to monitor the skies and be able to connect to detect missiles which were arriving, and it's for me it was astonishing to discover how much of our current technology actually comes from that moment. Like the idea that you can link computers over long distances comes from that, very concretely from that project. The idea that computers are not calculators but more like real-time information processing devices comes from that project. So there were really a lot of milestones connected to this history of like military computing technology beginning of the 60s. So that's one big chapter, and the other big chapter is that analog computers are really good at doing chaotic systems. So I started exploring equations which are simple to patch but give like really unpredictable, very complex signal trajectories. And I started putting these things together also because in time they're very much together. It's like, the coldest part of the Cold War was sort of beginning of the 60s, the moment before the US shot their first human into space, like before the Russians were actually in advance. So that was really sort of a scramble on the American side to sort of catch up. So that's on one hand, and on the other hand, there's also really the moment where chaos was discovered in these computing devices, like on digital side, but also on the analog side. And I found this combination super poetic, that on the one hand you have this drive to have a surveillance system which makes the world completely transparent and everything visible as a kind of panopticon. And then on the other hand, you have within this, in the heart of this clarity, like the heart of these computing devices, you have actually discovery that there is a kind of fundamental unpredictability happening. And I started seeing that as a kind of resistance which comes from machines and not from humans. Okay, so that's a very long story, but those are these two elements, like this global surveillance and on the other hand, chaos in the machines. And the film is, for me, really a way to put these things together and then have narrative elements for the first time in my life. There's some dialogue, like traces of dialogue, which sort of indicate this whole Cold War era through the medium of like the science fiction films from that time, which have themes which are very often very claustrophobic and paranoia, and like they're afraid of aliens, and like there's all these metaphors which are quite obvious. Yeah, so that's, for me, that was different to have traces of narration, even though it's a completely abstract film, like all the images are abstract, but in the soundtrack there are some traces of narration, and I also reuse elements of soundtracks from that time. And then the decision to make it a feature was really because, well, actually for two reasons. One is that I realized the images I was making needed time. Like it's a universe of images which is quite alien itself. And I really felt I needed time to drag the audience in and also give them time to actually watch and become accustomed to these images and the processes happening in them. And it's also on a very different level. It was a film I made during the COVID pandemic, and I lived in Belgium at the time, and there the lockdowns were quite severe, so there was nothing you could do. So I thought, well, I'm just going to make a feature. So that's why it happened.